The storm had rolled through overnight, leaving the air thick with mud and the scent of broken pine. By morning, a fallen red oak sprawled across the ravine like some giant beast laid to rest. Its roots were torn from the earth, gnarled and dripping. And caught in that dark lattice of soil and wood was something the rain had washed clean, a shred of blue fabric pale against the wet roots fluttering where no wind reached. It took only one glance for me to know that piece of cloth didn't belong to the forest. Tell me where you're listening from and tap subscribe if you think every buried truth deserves daylight. Before that spring storm ever hit life in Pendleton County moved to its own slow rhythm, the kind that made outsiders restless but gave the rest of us peace. Mornings came with wood smoke and the steady hum of pickup trucks warming up in driveways. Evenings meant porch lights glowing across long, quiet yards. You could tell the time of year by the sound of the wind sharper in November carrying the dry rustle of oak leaves and the faint crack of a distant rifle from the ridges. I'd been retired from the Forest Service for nearly a decade, then though I still kept my old radio tuned to emergency frequencies out of habit. My days were simple coffee at dawn walk with my dog by the North Fork River, and an afternoon drive into town for supplies. The town of Franklin sat in the low valley like a pocket of calm one main street, a diner that closed at 8, and the smell of coal smoke when the temperature dropped below 40. That's where you'd find Richard Miller most mornings when hunting season came around third booth from the window plaid jacket. Black coffee, no cream. Richard wasn't the loud type. He carried himself the way men do when they've earned quiet, steady eyes, slow movements, and a handshake that didn't need proving. He'd been hunting those mountains since he was a teenager. Folks joked that he could find his way through Spruce Knob blindfolded. His wife Susan taught third grade over at Franklin Elementary. You'd see her in the grocery store after school, hair pulled back, always in a hurry to make dinner before the kids' bedtime. The Millers were the kind of family that reminded you what ordinary goodness looked like. 2 kids in Little League, a modest 2-story home with a red tin roof, and Sunday mornings spent in the same church pew they'd sat in for years. Richard's yearly hunting trips were almost a tradition in town. Every fall when the mornings turned crisp and the fog clung low to the hollows, he'd head out alone into the backcountry for 3 days. It wasn't about trophies or bragging rights. For Richard, it was solitude, a chance to breathe in the silence of the mountains and come back a little lighter. The man was as methodical as they came. Before every trip, he'd clear the kitchen table, spread out his map, and trace his route with a pencil. Susan once told me he'd even circle where he planned to camp, where he'd refill his water, and which ridge he'd follow home. He always said, if I'm not back by Monday night, start calling Tuesday morning. That November morning, he kissed Susan goodbye, loaded his gear into his old blue Ford, and drove off towards Spruce Knob Ridge. It was the kind of cold that bites your ears, the kind hunters call good air. There was nothing unusual about it, no argument, no sign of hesitation. Just another trip in a long line of them. I remember that weekend clearly because the wind wouldn't let up. The temperature barely crept above 35 and a low mist sat over the valley. Folks in town grumbled about power flickers and frozen pipes. Still, when Monday came and Richard hadn't returned, nobody thought much of it. Maybe he'd stayed an extra night. Maybe weather had slowed him down. Susan called me Tuesday morning, her voice soft but uneasy. Dan, it's probably nothing she said, but Richard's still not home. She tried to laugh it off, but there was a tremor underneath. I told her I'd drive out by the trailhead just to check. By the time I reached the parking lot, frost was still hanging on the tall grass, and there it was. Richard's truck, parked straight, locked everything inside neat as a pin. The passenger seat held his thermos still half full. No sign of trouble, no broken glass, just stillness. I waited there longer than I should have, watching the clouds move over the ridgeline. The wind whistled through the antenna on his truck. There's something about that kind of quiet that starts to feel wrong, like the woods themselves are holding their breath. Back in town, Susan tried to stay calm. She told me she kept the porch light on that night just in case. I could picture it from the highway, that one steady glow cutting through the dark yard while the rest of the town slept. By Wednesday, Sheriff Ridley had assembled a few of us to start a check. He was a thick-set man with the kind of patience built from years of search calls that ended well enough. He told us it was probably a sprained ankle, a wrong turn, a man taking his time. That's how it always starts. The first day out, we found nothing but deer prints and our own tracks crossing back on themselves. The forest up there is ancient, uneven wild, full of hollows that swallow sound. When you call a man's name and it doesn't echo back, it plays tricks on your mind. That night I stopped by the miller's house. Susan had the map spread out on the same kitchen table he'd used the week before. Her hands were trembling as she traced his route. The kids were upstairs, their bedroom light leaking through the floorboards. She looked up at me and said, "He always keeps his word." I didn't know what to say to that. The next morning, frost turned the roads white. The mountains stood so still they looked carved from stone. I remember thinking if something was wrong out there, the forest wasn't giving it up easy. That Thursday evening, I drove past the miller's house again. The porch light was still burning. The living room blinds were drawn, but through the glass I could see Susan sitting at the kitchen table, head bowed over her phone. Out by the edge of the yard, the woods began dark, endless, and silent. The kind of silence that doesn't wait for morning. That Thursday night hung heavier than most. The porch light at the miller's house burned through the fog like a single stubborn flame, and the gravel road outside their gate looked as though no one had driven it in days. I sat in my truck across the street, engine off, listening to the kind of quiet that settles deep into your bones. The sheriff had said they'd start a wider search in the morning, but Susan hadn't slept since Tuesday. I knew because every time I passed the house that same light was on and her shadow was moving from room to room. There's something about a woman waiting that can hollow a place out faster than time ever could. By dawn, the temperature had dropped below freezing, the air sharp and metallic. When I pulled into the ranger station, Sheriff Ridley was already there, leaning against the hood of his cruiser with a styrofoam cup in hand. He looked like a man who'd seen too many searches start the same way. "We'll start at the trailhead," he said, his voice low, steady. "Bring your radio and that old compass of yours. GPS can get spotty up there." By the time we reached Spruce Knob Ridge, volunteers were already showing up, hunters, mostly the kind of men who knew these hills better than their own backyards. Some brought dogs, others just wore heavy coats and carried the same quiet determination. You could smell the wet leaves and hear the frost breaking under boots as we spread out across the trail. Richard's pickup was still parked neatly in the same spot as before. Nothing inside had been disturbed, not a single fingerprint out of place. His map sat folded on the seat like he'd meant to grab it but forgot. We started calling his name as we moved into the woods. The sound carried only a few yards before the trees swallowed it. The wind up there doesn't move the way it does in the valley. It comes in waves, bending the oaks until they creak like old bones. Every time a branch snapped, I felt my heart jump, thinking it might be him. But it never was. The dogs worked hard, noses to the ground, tails low, but the scent trail vanished almost immediately on the rocky path. It was like he'd stepped off the earth and taken the air with him. By the second day, the search expanded 3 miles in every direction. Helicopters swept over the ridges, but from above, all they'd see was a wall of color, endless brown and green. No movement, no sign of life. Susan came out once just to stand at the trailhead. She didn't say anything. She just held onto her coat collar and stared into the woods as if her eyes could will him to walk back out. The sheriff gently told her to head home, and she did, but not before touching the truck door. I still remember that small, shaking hand against the blue paint. We found nothing. Not a piece of fabric, not a footprint, not even an empty shell casing. Around here you lose things all the time, a knife, a glove, but never a man. That's what didn't make sense. Richard knew how to survive. He knew where to find water, how to build a fire in the rain. Even hurt, he'd have left a sign. A broken branch, a strip of cloth, anything. But there was nothing. And when a man like that disappears without a trace, it eats at your sense of reason. By Friday, the weather turned mean. Freezing drizzle coated the leaves, and the fog came down thick enough to hide your own boots. I remember standing on a ridge, watching my breath drift in front of me, and thinking how this mountain could hide an entire army if it wanted to. I'd seen storms tear through here before, seen rivers change course overnight, but what haunted me most was the silence. It wasn't the natural kind, it was too clean, too still, like the woods were holding their breath. That night at the command post, everyone looked worn. The sheriff sat by the fire, rubbing his hands together, talking through every possible scenario. Could have been a fall, he said, staring into the flames. Maybe he broke something, couldn't move. I wanted to believe that. We all did. But by then, it had been nearly 5 days. You can last that long without food, but not without water, not in those cold conditions. Someone mentioned bears, but Ridley shook his head. If a bear had taken him, we'd have signs of a fight. Blood, torn fabric, something. The fire popped, and nobody spoke after that. Saturday morning, I joined a smaller group heading toward an old fire road that cut north through the ridge. It was rough country, steep drops, slick rock, and gullies choked with brush. Around mid-afternoon, we stopped near a hollow to rest. One of the younger volunteers, a guy named Matt, noticed something at the edge of the clearing. "Looks like a burn mark," he said, pointing. We walked over and saw a small ring of blackened earth, a campfire recent, maybe a week old at most. My heart kicked up. It was tucked out of sight, far from any trail. Too far. We searched the area inch by inch. 2 empty shell casings glinted in the leaves, dull brass barely visible in the dim light. The sheriff bent down, picked them up with a glove. "Same caliber as his rifle," he murmured. Everyone went still. For the first time, we had something real. Proof he'd been here. But it didn't make sense. Why set up camp so far off route? Why fire only twice? The ground around the fire pit showed no signs of struggle, no tracks but our own. The dogs circled and whined, confused, unable to follow anything away from that spot. It was like the trail ended there, full stop. That night, Susan called me again. Her voice was hoarse, fragile. "They found something," she asked. I hesitated. "Just a campsite," I said. "We're not sure yet, but it looks recent." There was a long pause. "He always followed his roots," she whispered. "Always." I didn't have an answer for her. Some things you just can't explain, not in a way that helps. Over the next few days, the search widened even more. State rescue teams joined in, along with game wardens and more volunteers from neighboring counties. Every ridge started to look the same: endless wet leaves, slick stones, patches of fog that came and went like ghosts. We checked ravines, creek beds, even old mine shafts. Each time we found nothing. The dogs grew tired, their handlers frustrated. A few men muttered about the mountain being cursed about how it had swallowed people before. I didn't put stock in that kind of talk. But I'll admit something about it felt wrong, off balance, like we were chasing someone who wasn't meant to be found. By the second week, hope had thinned out. The sheriff stood before the group hat in his hands and told us they'd have to suspend the search with winter closing in. His voice cracked once when he said it. We all knew what that meant. When a search is called off up here, it usually stays that way. Susan didn't come that day. She'd stopped answering the phone altogether. People in town started speaking of Richard in the past tense, but not her. Every night, her porch light still burned, casting a small circle of gold into the dark yard. I tried to move on, but you don't forget something like that. Every time I drove through those woods, I caught myself looking into the tree line, half expecting to see him step out with that old rifle slung across his shoulder, apologizing for all the trouble. But the forest stayed silent. Even in summer, when the air turned warm and the grass grew high, there was a chill in that place I couldn't shake. 2 winters came and went like that. By the spring of 2023, most folks had stopped mentioning his name, though everyone remembered. That's the thing about small towns, the past never leaves. It just waits for the right storm to stir it up again. When that week of heavy rain came through, I didn't think much of it. The river's swelled roads washed out the usual mess. But a few days after the last downpour, the sheriff called me early one morning. His voice was tight. "You might want to come down to the ridge," he said. "Something's been found." I didn't ask what. I just drove. By the time I reached the site, the rain had turned the soil to thick red mud. The air smelled of wet bark and decay. A group of hikers had come across a massive oak that had fallen across a ravine, its roots torn up in a tangle taller than a man. The sheriff stood near the base, talking quietly with a deputy. He looked at me when I walked up, and I could tell from his eyes this wasn't another false lead. He pointed to the roots. At first I didn't see it. Then the light shifted, and I noticed something caught among the tangled wood, a scrap of faded blue fabric pressed into the mud. It was small, but my stomach turned the moment I saw it. The sheriff didn't have to say a word. The mountain had finally given something back. We stood there for a long time, neither of us speaking, the sound of water dripping from the roots filling the air. I thought about Susan, about the years she'd spent waiting for an answer that never came. And for the first time since that cold November morning, I knew the silence of those woods was about to break. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept seeing that cloth in the mud moving slightly in the breeze. After 2 years of nothing, the mountain had spoken, but it wasn't done yet. The rain had only stopped a few hours earlier, but the ground still glistened as if the storm hadn't left. The oak stood there like some fallen monument, its massive root ball jutting up from the earth, thick with mud and broken stone. Deputies had roped off the area, and a few hikers stood farther back, their faces pale in the gray light. I'd seen a lot of strange recoveries in my years with the Forest Service, but this was different. The smell hit first. That deep, earthy sweetness that comes when the ground's been turned after too long. I remember stepping closer and catching a flicker of color beneath the roots. It wasn't bark or moss. It was fabric blue, faint and worn, the kind of color that doesn't belong in the woods. Sheriff Ridley's voice was low when he said, "We're going to have to dig carefully." The forensic team worked slow, almost reverent scraping at the mud with brushes and trowels. Every few minutes, the sound of their tools would pause, replaced by the soft clinking of roots shifting under their weight. I stood just outside the tape raincoat, zipped to my chin, watching the dark earth give up its secret inch by inch. First came the corner of a backpack, waterlogged and half-torn. Then a scrap of canvas that might have been a jacket. When one of the techs lifted it, the smell grew sharper, older. You could feel it in your throat. By the time they uncovered the belt buckle, everyone knew what they'd find next. It took nearly 4 hours before the skeleton appeared curved slightly, as though whoever it was had been pushed or folded into that hollow. The bones had fused with the roots, tangled like they'd grown together. When the skull came clear, even from where I stood, I could see the dent on the left side. A clean, deep impression, unnatural. The sheriff exhaled through his nose, rubbed a hand over his jaw, and said quietly, "That's not a fall." He didn't look at me, but he didn't have to. We both knew. The area went quiet except for the hum of the generator powering the floodlights. The woods had that heavy silence that comes after a confession. Even the birds stayed still. When the body was finally lifted out, wrapped in tarp and canvas, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like the end of something we hadn't even understood yet. They boxed up everything, the clothes, the belt, the backpack, and carried it out under tarps. I followed the sheriff back to his cruiser. Neither of us spoke until we hit the main road. He finally said, "We'll send it all to Charleston tonight. See what they can pull." His voice had that flatness I recognized, the kind that comes when a case turns from hope to proof. The next few days blurred together. Rain gave way to clear skies, but the chills stayed. Forensics came back faster than anyone expected. Dental records matched. It was Richard. I was sitting in my kitchen when Ridley called to tell me. I didn't say much, just, yeah, and then thanks. I hung up and sat there with the coffee cooling in my hand, staring out the window at the ridge. 2 years of searching rumors and unanswered questions, and he'd been right there the whole time, buried under a tree we'd probably walked past a dozen times. Word spread fast. In towns like ours, it always does. Folks started stopping by the diner again, whispering over their plates, wondering what really happened out there. I tried to stay away from the talk, but it followed me. People said maybe he'd fallen, maybe the tree had shifted years ago, maybe it was all some freak accident, but the sheriff put that to rest quick. The medical examiner found that indentation in his skull one precise blow, heavy and deliberate. No fall could have done that. The man had been dead before that oak ever came down. Someone had killed him, then hidden him under the roots. For the first time in years, we weren't talking about a missing person. We were talking about murder. The lab reports came back with one more surprise. On the straps of Richard's old backpack, where the mud hadn't eaten through, they found DNA that didn't belong to him. A full male profile. I was in the sheriff's office when the results hit. He looked at the paper, frowned, and said, "Well, that's something." They ran it through CODIS, the national database. The match came back that same afternoon, a man named Johnny Barrett. I knew the name. Everyone did. Johnny had been one of those drifters who never quite belonged anywhere but the woods. Lived off the land sometimes with a rifle, sometimes with traps. He'd been arrested more times than I could count for poaching, trespassing, carrying a weapon where he shouldn't. Never violent, not officially, but there was always that edge around him. The kind of man who lived by his own rules and didn't like being told otherwise. Ridley leaned back in his chair, thumbed the corner of the report, and said, "He was picked up downstate right around the time Richard went missing." That caught my attention. Turned out Johnny had been arrested 100 miles away. Caught hunting deer out of season just days after the search for Richard began. Armed alone and quick to lie about where he'd been. Back then, no one thought to connect the two. Now, it didn't look like coincidence. We started retracing old reports from 2021. There was one from a game warden who'd mentioned running into Barrett during the search. He said Johnny admitted seeing another hunter that week, a man matching Richard's description, but claimed they'd just nodded and kept walking. At the time, it seemed harmless. Out here, crossing paths in the woods is about as common as sunrise. But with the DNA on that backpack, the story didn't fit anymore. When the warrant came through, I joined the sheriff and 2 deputies on the drive out to find him. Johnny didn't keep an address. He floated between relatives and cheap motels. We hit dead ends for days, each lead colder than the last, until an anonymous tip came in. Said he was holed up in an old trailer near a logging site 2 counties over. We rolled up before dawn. The air was still frost on the grass. The place looked abandoned, windows, boarded roof sagging, but there was a thin wisp of smoke coming from the stovepipe. Ridley motioned for the others to fan out. He raised the megaphone and called out Johnny Barrett. "This is the sheriff's office. Step outside." For a long moment, nothing happened. Then the door opened, slow hinges, creaking, and there he was. Unarmed hands, up eyes dull like a man who'd run out of road. He didn't fight. Didn't even speak until they cuffed him. Just stared down at the mud like he'd already seen this day coming. Back at the station, I sat in while they questioned him. At first, he denied everything. Said he'd seen Richard on the trail, exchanged a nod, and that was all. His voice was calm, flat. He'd rehearsed it. But when Ridley slid a photo across the table, the one showing Richard's old backpack laid out on the lab table, Johnny's face changed. The sheriff told him quiet as could be. "Your DNA's on that strap, Johnny. That means you touched it. That means you lied." The silence that followed was long enough to hear the hum of the overhead lights. Then Johnny leaned back, rubbed his jaw, and said, "He was the one who started it." His voice was different now, tired, like he'd been holding his breath for years. What came next was a mix of confession and excuse. He said he'd been tracking a deer that morning in a restricted area. Richard had caught him, called him out for poaching, threatened to report him. Johnny said it turned into an argument, then a scuffle. He claimed Richard grabbed at his pack, tried to take his rifle. "I just wanted him to back off," he said. "I didn't mean to." He stopped there. He told them he'd swung something heavy, a rock, maybe a branch he couldn't remember. And when Richard fell, he panicked, dragged the body off the trail deeper into the woods and found that hollow under the oak's roots. Said he thought it'd be a good place to hide him. He'd covered the body with dirt and leaves, then took the rifle and backpack to make it look like Richard had wandered off. Later, he burned what he could. When Ridley asked about the knife buried in the oak's root, Johnny stared at the wall. "Don't remember," he muttered. I could tell from his tone he remembered just fine, he just didn't want to say. By the end of the night, the statement was signed, and Johnny Barrett was booked on second-degree murder. It should have felt like closure. Instead, it felt like the woods had just shifted again, like the ground still wasn't steady. I thought about Susan, how she'd spent 2 years waiting for answers. Now she had them, and they were worse than not knowing. 3 weeks later, before the case could go to trial, Johnny was found dead in his jail cell. Heart attack, they said. I don't know if I believed it or not. The sheriff did. The body just gives out sometimes, he told me. Maybe he was right. Maybe a man can only carry so much guilt before it stops him cold. That night I drove out to where they'd found Richard. The oak was still there. Roots exposed, a silent witness to everything that had happened beneath it. The wind moved through the hollow branches with a sound like whispering. I stood there until the light faded, thinking about how long that tree had stood, how many storms it had weathered. And I couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, it had been the mountain itself that decided it was time for the truth to come out. When I finally turned to leave, the woods were quiet again, just the soft drip of water from the roots. The case was closed on paper, but out there under that cold stretch of sky, it didn't feel over. Not really. I remember the day they brought Johnny Barrett's body out of the jail as clearly as if it were yesterday. It was early morning, a gray kind of cold that makes sound carry farther than it should. The deputies stood around the back of the coroner's van, their breath hanging in the air while the sheriff signed a clipboard. No one said a word. It was supposed to be a heart attack, sudden and clean, but the look on Ridley's face told me he wasn't buying that any more than I was. Death has a way of quieting a place, but this one brought a different kind of stillness, not grief, not even shock, just the weight of something unfinished. The man who'd finally admitted to killing Richard Miller had gone to his grave before a jury ever heard his name. For some, that was enough. For others, it left too much undone. In the weeks that followed, the county went back to its usual rhythm. The case was closed on paper, but nobody really moved on. You could feel it at the diner in the long pauses between conversations. Susan still came in on Thursdays, sat by the window and ordered coffee she never finished. She'd nod politely when folks offered condolences, but you could see the question still circling in her eyes, the same one we all carried. Why had it really happened? What could have driven a man like Barrett to murder another in cold blood out in those woods? I didn't have an answer then. Truth be told, I still don't. But I kept turning it over like a stone in my hand, trying to find its shape. When I went back to the ridge that spring, the ground had finally dried. The fallen oak was still there, roots jutting up like a scar. The sheriff had left a small wooden cross in the clearing, nothing fancy, just 2 rough pieces tied with twine. I stood there a long while listening to the stream that ran below the hill. It had that quiet gurgle that fills the space where words won't go. I thought about Richard, about the last time I'd seen him laughing at the counter of the hardware store talking about the weather and deer tracks. It's strange how a man's whole life can narrow down to a single moment, a single decision made in anger that can't ever be undone. From what Barrett told us in that interview room, it wasn't planned. He said he'd been hunting illegally, nothing new for him, and Richard caught him in the act. The way he told it, they argued tempers flared, and one blow changed everything. Maybe that's true. Maybe it isn't. I've learned not to put much faith in the stories men tell when they're cornered. But I remember the look on his face that night, the twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes wouldn't meet mine. He wasn't afraid. He was spent, like the fight had gone out of him years before. What stayed with me most isn't his confession. It's the detail he didn't want to talk about. The knife. The one found buried deep in the oak's roots, driven in so hard that even with tools, the lab techs couldn't pry it loose without splintering the wood. He stared at the photo of it for a long time in that interrogation room, then shook his head and muttered, "That's not how I remember it." I asked him what he meant. He just said, "The woods don't forget." I didn't understand it then, and maybe I still don't, but I've thought about those words more than I should. There's something about this land, these mountains, that holds on to secrets long after people are gone. I've seen it in the way fog moves through the hollows, the way storms roll down and carve new scars into the hillsides. Nature doesn't erase what we do. It just covers it for a while. When the oak came down that spring, it wasn't an accident. It was the mountain giving up what it had kept too long. After Barrett's death, the state closed the file. The evidence was clear, the story tied up neatly enough for the records. But Ridley and I spent one last afternoon in his office going through the photographs. He wanted to be sure nothing had been missed. He laid out each image in order: the backpack, the belt buckle, the shape of the skull, the angle of the blow. It was methodical, clinical. Then he stopped at one photo, the wide shot of the body before it was moved. You could see how the smaller roots had grown around the bones, thin as wire. You ever think he said quietly that he might not have died right away? I didn't answer. Some questions don't deserve to be spoken out loud. Susan came by the sheriff's office a week later to collect Richard's personal items. There wasn't much left, a few trinkets from his pack, a pocket knife that had rusted shut a strip of his jacket. She thanked us, her voice steady, and asked if the area would stay open to the public again. The sheriff told her it would once the investigation was officially wrapped. She nodded and said, "Good." He loved that place. Then she looked at me and added, "I think I'll take the kids up there one day. Let them see where their father was found. Maybe then it'll feel real." I didn't know what to say, so I just told her it was beautiful that time of year, green and quiet. The papers ran the story for about a week. "Local man's killer dies in custody." That was the headline. It sounded clean, finished. But for those of us who knew the Millers, it wasn't so simple. You don't bury that kind of grief with the body. It lingers in the creak of floorboards, in the smell of a jacket you can't bring yourself to throw away. I saw Susan again months later at the grocery store. She looked tired, but lighter somehow, like she'd finally made peace with what she'd been given. Not justice exactly, but the closest thing to it. Sometimes I drive past the old trailhead where Richard's truck was found. The lot looks smaller now, swallowed up by weeds and time. The wooden sign marking the North Fork Trail is faded, the letters worn to ghost shapes. But I can still see it all, the search teams fanning out the dogs, straining against their leads, the echo of voices calling his name through the trees. I wonder if the mountain remembers that too. Not long ago, a new storm came through and uprooted another cluster of trees near the ridge. Nothing was found this time, just broken branches and soil washed clean down the slope. But when I heard about it, I couldn't help but think of that first storm 2 years ago, how it revealed what everyone had stopped looking for. Maybe that's how it works. The truth waits until we're ready, then lets itself be seen. I sometimes go back there alone. I park where his truck used to sit and follow the trail for a mile or so until the wind shifts and the smell of pine thickens in the air. The forest sounds different now, softer somehow. There's a calm that wasn't there before, as if the mountain finally settled after years of holding its breath. I'll stand by that fallen oak, the one that changed everything, and trace my hand along the rough bark. The knife's still there, buried deep, rusted now, but visible if you look close enough. I think about the rage it must have taken to drive it in like that, and the silence that followed after. Barrett's gone, but the story didn't end with him. It's in the ground, in the roots that grew around a man who never should have died that way. I think about Richard every November when the first frost hits and the hunters start filing into those woods. They walk the same trails, breathe the same cold air, and most will make it home again. But every now and then, when the light fades just right and the wind moves through the trees, I swear you can feel the weight of what's buried there. Not just a body, but all the questions that will never be answered. The sheriff retired last fall. Before he left, he gave me a copy of the final report. I keep it in my desk drawer not because I need to read it, but because I like knowing it's their proof that some truths, however dark, can't stay buried forever. Still, whenever a storm rolls in from the west and the thunder shakes the windows, I find myself looking out toward the ridge. Part of me expects to see that oak standing again, roots deep and secret, holding tight to something the rest of us can't see. Maybe that's foolish. Or maybe it's just human wanting to believe that the land remembers the people we lose. Because out there under those hills and trees, the line between the living and the gone feels thin as mist. And every time the wind changes, I think I can still hear it, the low, hollow sound of the forest giving back what it once took. Sometimes I still drive that winding road up toward Spruce Knob, especially when the evenings start to cool and the fog drifts low across the hollows. There's a bend just before the ridge where you can see the tops of the trees roll like a green ocean. And every time I take that turn, I think about how small we really are out here. The land forgets us faster than we think, but sometimes for reasons I'll never understand, it remembers just long enough to speak. After Barrett died, the sheriff's office closed the file and sent what little was left of the evidence to archives in Charleston. It was the right call, legally speaking, no trial to hold, no jury to convince, but it felt hollow. A man had confessed to a killing, and then he'd vanished from the story just as quickly as he'd entered it. No prison term. No verdict, just silence. Susan told me later that she didn't want to attend any kind of memorial service for him. She said she'd prayed for peace, not punishment, and I think that was the closest she ever came to forgiveness. But there's a difference between peace and relief. Peace stays, relief fades. I stayed close to her family for a while after that. We'd talk on her porch when the kids were asleep, the light from her kitchen spilling out onto the steps. Sometimes she'd ask me about the investigation details I wasn't supposed to share, but mostly she'd just sit quietly and listen to the night sounds. Frogs in the ditch, the wind in the birch trees. Once she said, almost to herself, I used to love the sound of the woods. I didn't know what to say, because I knew exactly what she meant. The forest had taken something from her that no man could give back, not even with an arrest or a confession. It took months before she went up there again. The sheriff and I drove with her, stopping near the old trailhead where Richard's truck had been found. The path had grown over since the last search. Grass and ferns covered the ruts from the four-wheelers, and the missing person poster that used to hang on the signpost was long gone. Susan stood there a while, then asked to see the spot where he'd been found. The oak had been cut down and cleared. By then what was left of it turned into soil and brush. I remember watching her kneel by the stump and place her hand on the earth. Not crying, not praying, just touching it like she was feeling for a pulse that had long since stopped. When she stood up, she said quietly, "He always said the woods felt alive. Maybe they were just listening." The following summer, the county renamed that section of the trail Miller Hollow. It wasn't a big announcement, just a new wooden sign at the fork where the ridge trail meets the creek. A few of us were there the day it went up. No cameras, no speeches. Susan brought the kids and they helped the ranger tighten the bolts. It was a small thing, but it gave the story an ending that the law never could. The forest had kept him, and in a way it would keep his name too. I think about Johnny Barrett sometimes. Not with sympathy exactly, but with a kind of reluctant curiosity. The man lived most of his life on the edges of things between law and wilderness, between right and wrong, and maybe that's where he died too. I'll never know what truly went through his head that day on the trail, or why he let anger take him that far. But when they found him dead in that cell, something about it felt inevitable, like the woods had finally finished what they started. Some people said it was karma. Others said it was just his heart giving out. Maybe both are true. For Sheriff Ridley, the case marked the end of his career. He retired that fall, left town, and moved closer to his daughter in Roanoke. I think it took more out of him than he let on. He'd spent nearly 40 years looking for answers buried in the ground, and this case reminded him that sometimes the truth doesn't save anyone. It just arrives too late to matter. When I visited him a few months before he left, he handed me an old file folder. "You keep it," he said. "You were there from the start." Inside were copies of the reports, photos from the site, and his handwritten notes. I've never shown them to anyone. They sit in the bottom drawer of my desk, wrapped in brown paper, untouched. Some things are better left where they are. As for me, I stayed. I couldn't leave the mountains even if I wanted to. They've been part of my blood too long, but I see them differently now. Every time the clouds gather or a storm shakes the ridges, I think of that oak tearing from the ground, exposing what no one was supposed to find. It's strange how a single act of nature can close a circle that 2 years of searching couldn't. The land gave him back when it was ready, not a moment sooner. Susan eventually remarried a quiet man from Elkins who works maintenance at the high school. They live just outside town now, still near the same stretch of forest. Her kids are grown. One's in the service, the other's studying forestry at WVU, of all things. Sometimes I see her at the store. We'll exchange a few words about the weather or the roads, and then she'll smile, that small, careful smile people wear when they've learned to live alongside loss instead of under it. I think that's as close to healing as any of us ever get. Every fall, I still visit the trail. I'll walk about a mile in until the light starts to dim, then sit on a fallen log where the sound of the creek carries through the trees. The forest is quiet in a different way now, less secretive, more forgiving. The air smells of moss and pine, and when the wind moves, it sounds almost like breathing. I take my time there because I know what it cost to make that silence possible. People often talk about closure like it's something you can hold in your hands, like a verdict or a signed piece of paper. But I've learned that real closure isn't found in what's written down. It lives in the small choices that follow the porch light that finally gets turned off the trail sign that carries a name, the family that learns how to keep moving forward. The kind of closure that's quiet enough to go unnoticed by everyone except the people who earned it. Sometimes I think about the night we first went searching for him, the flashlights cutting through the fog, the dogs circling the calls, echoing into the dark. We thought we were chasing a living man, then not a memory. I remember how cold the air felt, how sure I was that we'd find him just over the next ridge. It took me a long time to accept that we weren't meant to. The mountain had other plans, and maybe that's what haunts me most, not the crime itself, but the way nature and time conspired to tell the story in their own way. Now, when I tell people about Richard Miller, I don't start with how he died. I start with how he lived his steady hand, his patience, the way he moved through the woods, like he was part of them. I tell them about his family. The laughter in that kitchen the night before he left, the kind of man who made maps on the table so no one ever had to worry. That's the version that matters, because long after the case file gathers dust and the tree roots rot away, what's left is the echo of who we were before everything broke. I don't know if the mountains keep memories, but I believe they keep balance. What they take, they eventually return, sometimes as storms, sometimes as stories. Maybe that's the only kind of justice the wild knows. And for men like Richard, maybe that's enough. If this story stayed with you, share it not for views, not for numbers, but so no one's name gets lost to the dark.